Alright, so let's get started with this, and I think a little bit of warm-up would be interesting. In this episode, we will get used to using C#, and also I will be including the GDScript equivalent of what I'm doing, so that if you actually don't want to use C# for this series and just want to follow the tower defense aspect, that's something that you will be able to do. The thing is that the explanations will be for the C# script, and then I will be providing a visual of what the equivalent in GDScript is. So yeah. So this is the project setting. What I did basically is create a new texture folders, and I've set a red color to it, and I removed the scene and script that I created in the previous video because they were here only for demonstration purposes. Regarding the textures, at the moment you can go in the description and find the link toward this GitHub repository, and you will be able to go in the code thing here and download a zip with all the textures in it. I will be updating this as the series will go on, so you will be able to re-download it later. It will update on this page. And eventually at some point I will make videos about how I actually make my assets. So anyway, the thing is that for this episode we will deal with something very simple, and I was thinking we can start creating an enemy. So we will spend a bit of time on creating an enemy, since it will not add too much complexity too fast. And this will help us get familiar with C# and Godot in general if you're starting with Godot, and even if it is your first C# Godot project. Okay, so first I'm going to create a folder for my scenes, and I'm going to make a scenes 2D folder. And I will set the color to blue so that it kind of mirrors the blue of 2D nodes from Godot. And from there I will just create a 2D scene. Okay, and I will rename this 2D scene enemy 2D. Alright, can save it in there, scenes 2D and enemy 2D. Okay, cool. The first thing I will do for this enemy is to actually display a texture. So I'm going to add a node, which is a sprite 2D node, the dedicated node to display a solid sprite. And I'm going to drag and drop it, or you can use the inspector, it doesn't really matter. The thing is that you do want this texture right here. Let's actually take a few seconds to show you what happens if we do run the scene and actually open this enemy scene alone. What happens is that we see the enemy is at the top left corner. And the reason for this is because by default, what Godot does is use this blue rectangle here as the default viewport, and as you can see, the enemy is positioned around the origin of the axis. So we could technically move this enemy in the middle of the screen, but in order to make our game maintainable and easy to make on the long run, what we want to do instead is actually make sure that this enemy is properly centered around the axis, so that when we position it in the world, for example, it is not like offset it far away from where the position is. So right now, before we do anything else, I will actually create a new scene, which is going to be a world 2D scene. And the purpose of this scene basically is going to be displaying the enemy and positioning the enemy, right? So that we can see it at the middle of the screen and not like somewhere in the corner. So I'm just going to save this scene in its own folder, world 2D, and we're going to save that. Now what we want to do is obviously bring the enemy 2D within this world, so we just, drag and drop it, or I guess that we can instantiate a child scene maybe? Yeah, that would work too. But anyway, usually I drag and drop. So here we are. We have the world and we have the enemy within the world, so technically we can move it to have this enemy move around this blue area here, but we will do something slightly different. Instead of relying on this blue rectangle to be the viewport that displays what we want to display in the world, we will actually use a camera. So the difference between using this blue rectangle and using a camera is that if we use the rectangle here and that the world moves, we actually need to move everything around this blue rectangle here, which is not something you want to do, right? Don't want to move the entire world just so that the rendering is different. Instead, we create a camera which here is going to display a pink rectangle. And as we move this camera, we will see different portion of the world. So here we only move the camera instead of moving the entire world, and that's much easier. All right, so let's leave this camera here and this enemy here and see that if we do run the world scene, we correctly have the enemy at the center. All right, so that's a very basic thing you can do in Godot, right? Display a sprite at the center of the screen. So because this is a tower defense game and this is an enemy, we don't want the player controlling the movements of this enemy. So we will not be doing any kind of movements or anything. So instead we'll be doing something different for the scripting part of this episode, and we will be giving this enemy a name. Alright, so let's go back to the enemy 2D scene, and what we will do is we will see how we can create a node that will display a name for the enemy, and how we can use C# or a script to actually change the name of the enemy during runtime. The point here isn't really to give a name to the enemy. The point here is to show you how to use C# to modify the properties of a node while the game's running. So let's add a label node. Okay, so here we want to position this centered on top of the enemy. So what I do is that I go with a little bit of mathematics. I go in the layout and the transform, and we have the size and the position. So since I want to center it around the y-axis, the green axis, I offset the position on the left by going negative in x by half of the size, right? So now it's centered, which now allows me to press Alt and kind of, drag this, stretch it. And it will actually stretch equally on both sides, right and left. So yes, pretty cool. And now I will press the Alt key to have the movement thing, and then I will also press the Shift key to actually make sure that it sticks to this axis. I mean, it prevents you from offsetting it by, slightly going on the left or the right with your mouse. So anyway, let's put a little bit of text in there. So we're going to say text, or we're going to say enemy name, something like this, just to say that, okay, this is not something the player is supposed to be seeing, it's something that's supposed to be controlled by a script. And we will change that in the script right after. So let's change the align, horizontal align center, and vertical align bottom. Yeah, it doesn't really matter, I guess. And we should be good. Now, it's just a question of actually creating a script that will rename this enemy. So let's add the first script for this episode by adding an enemy 2D script. So before you create this script, if you already did, you can delete it. What you want to do is to actually make sure that the D at the end is in uppercase. It is important for the class name. I will come back to it very quickly. Okay, here we are in C#, and let's see what we have in the start. So at the very top, we have using Godot and using system. This is basically including libraries to your class. What this basically means is that when you're going to use functions or objects which come from an outside script, you will have to mention it like this by using the using keyword. That will basically include the necessary code or create connections so that you do get the necessary code that you will be using in the class. So in general, it's just a question of just adding those as you add functions and stuff that you use from different libraries, and there's not much to think about it really. Okay, so first here we declare a class by saying that we have a public partial class. So the reason why this class is partial is a Godot C# thing, right? In C# you can create a class just by having this. Then we have the class name, the enemy 2D, and here the D is an uppercase and not a lowercase, just like node 2D next to it. So the reason for this is because it is crucial and it is a must that when you create a class in C#, it matches the name of the file. Okay, so that's kind of a Godot C# thing. You gotta make sure that the class name matches the file name. That's alright. So you just never touch this. If you have to change it, actually go delete your file and create another one. And then we have semicolon, or colon actually, node 2D. So that is the extent that you may be using in Godot. So what this means is that in our class enemy 2D that we just created, we are bringing everything that is contained within Node 2D. So that's called inheritance if you want to check this out. But basically, yes, let's say that the Node 2D has a property position. Well, now the class enemy2D also has this property position because it inherits it from the Node 2D. And the very last thing we have on this default class creation here is those two curly brackets. So in GDScript, we actually use indentations to create blocks. In C# we have something which is a little bit more character driven, if you want to say that. We actually use actual characters like curly brackets to say, right, this is the beginning and this is the end. All right, so now we can actually think about editing the label that we have created. Here we need two things really. We need to know how to create a variable. We need to know how to create a function. So here let's create a variable. In C# we put the type first. So exactly the same type as you would in GDScript. A label is typed label, and then you put the name. So it's in the opposite order, type name. Now there's an extra step here. The thing is that in GDScript, the concept of public and private properties and functions doesn't exist. Everything is public in Godot. So if you don't know what public or private is, that's fine. You don't need that at the moment. We will go through this later. So the best way to actually ignore that at the moment is to make sure that everything's public. That's how Godot works, right? Everything's public. So at the moment, if you don't know, just put everything public and it will be exactly the same. Now let's see how we can declare a function. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to define the type of the function, and then we're going to define the name of the function. So here the type is going to be void, and the name is going to be rename label, or rename enemy actually. Okay, and I'm going to add the curly brackets, and here is the empty function. So again, we want to say that this is public, first thing. And second thing is we actually want to add arguments in there. When we want to rename the enemy, obviously we need a name to rename the enemy with. So here, same thing again, we put the type first and then we put the variable name or argument name. So we're going to have a string that we will name something like a text. So I'm trying a kind of naming convention here. I don't know if I would keep that. That's just like me trying something. Basically, when I have arguments, I'm going to say a underscore something, just to say that this is an argument, so that when you read the function, you actually know what is an argument and what is a class member, etc., etc. So I'm going to try that. Anyway, so now the thing is that we do have a variable to store the label, and we do have a function to actually modify the property of the label. There's only one thing left. How do we actually get the reference of this label? So there are two ways to go through that. We can either use the inspector from the editor to create a connection from the Godot editor, or we can use the getNode method to actually go reach the node in a intro. So let's not make things too complicated at the moment. Let's just use the good old usual export tag. So here we will just create a tag in front of our variable with export. Export, which means that we will define its value within the inspector of the editor. Okay, so make sure that we do save this, and then go back to Godot and see that the editor is telling us that the inspector might be out of date, and indeed we don't see the property we have created. So we're going to click the hammer to build, and we will have the property that will appear once it is done. All right, here it is, label. So we can assign it. Here we have the label, and there we go. We now have connected the reference to the code. It means that we can now change the property text property of this label. So yeah, just a quick reminder, if you want to know how to grab a property here, you want to find its name by hovering in the inspector or by right-clicking and going into documentation. But then the thing is that in C# it will have a slightly different name. The thing is that here we have text written like this, and in C# it will actually take an uppercase. That's the only difference. So here, let's take the label we have referenced as a variable, is dot operator, and reach its text value. And there we go. we now have access to the text and we can assign a new value to it. And this new value is going to be a text. All right. This function should be good enough to actually rename the enemy. So now we need to actually grab the flow of instruction that Godot go through to weave our little rename enemy function. So the simplest way here, and what I usually do at the beginning of all series, is to use the ready function. So we're going to create the ready function, void, and here we have underscore ready, and there we go. So we have a little bit of an error, not really an error, no, it is an error, but yeah, the thing is that here what we're doing is that we are overriding an existing function. What it means is that ready is already defined in a higher class that the class we have right now is inheriting from. So ready is either in Node2D or something higher. Here, for example, it's very most likely in the node object. So what it means is that we have to tell specifically that we are overriding this function. This is what we do in GDScript, just we don't say it. We do it without saying it, but here we can't do it without saying it, so we do say it. So when we rewrite on functions which usually have an underscore in front of them, it is crucial to actually say override. All right, quite easy actually. And as for the ready function name, you will see that here we have an uppercase again. So you will very quickly notice that there's a pattern. The properties and functions which are coming from the Godot API, they will take an uppercase. That's quite easy to remember. Right, so now that we have access to the ready function, we can just decide to rename the enemy. And we will name it with like, yeah, diamond. That's going to be fun because that's kind of a diamond enemy, diamond shape. More like a square, but yeah, almost a diamond. So we can save this and go back to Godot and try, well, we can actually save the enemy scene, but yeah, that's not the scene we want to run because we will only be able to see this little bit here. We want to go in the world. We're going to go in the world and run the world scene. And all right, we actually have the enemy at the center of the screen with the label being renamed with diamond. All right. Also, if you want to do that in GDScript, here is the code. All right, so let's actually make a little bit of an exercise which to see if you understood properly what we did and if you actually can reproduce what we're doing. So what you will want to be doing is actually display more enemies in this world, and I want those enemies to have different names, okay? So you will try to do that. You will pause the video and do that if you wish, but then you can come back here and see how I'm doing it. So if you don't do it exactly the same way, that's fine, as long as you get the intended result. But eventually you could learn something new from the way I'm doing it. So the way I'm doing this is that I will actually begin by duplicating the enemy that I have created here. I'm going to duplicate that and I will select the second one, press Alt, move it, and move the third one as well. Okay, so we have now 3 enemies. And the thing is that in their own script, they are renamed diamond. And what we want is all the enemies to have different names. So what I'm going to do is actually create a script for the world here, and that's going to be the world2d.cs. So at the moment, I will do this in quite a messy way, sort of. I will just create a few enemy 2D. So we're going to have the first enemy, and I will duplicate this line so that we have the second and third enemy. Then I will again override the ready function in this class, and I will basically rename each enemy by using the function that we have used. So here, the first enemy, I'm going to rename it to something like Josh. Second enemy now, I'm going to rename it something like Karen. And the third enemy, I'm renaming it with, I'm running out of names, so that's going to be, I don't know, let's go with Ira. But we're actually missing the references, so we need to go back to the editor and build a project so that we can connect all 3 enemies to this right there. So we're gonna have the enemy 1, enemy 2, enemy 3, and there we go. Let's actually run the scene to see how this evolves. Yep, we indeed have Josh, Karen, and Ira on the screen, which is exactly what I wanted. And again, here is the actual script if you want to do that. So you will notice that I do actually put a GD in front of all my classes. That's to make sure that they do not clash with the classes I do create in C#. So anyway, alright, so that's actually all I want to show you in this video. For the next one, I think I will be doing a health system for the enemy and actually make a debug way to damage the enemies. So if you want to try to do that before watching the video, please try. Otherwise, if you do like this, thanks about liking, subscribing, yada yada yada. And also if you want to contribute a little bit more to the channel, you can become a member. That's really appreciated. This being said, I will leave you there and I will see you in the next video. You take care and I'll leave you with the ending panel.